Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Pokemon Alpha Sapphire. In the last part we reached Petalburg City and met our dad as well as Wally and saw him catch his Ralts, and he gave us the Pokénav Plus instruments of the Pokeami and Super Training in the meanwhile. And I just showcased a moment ago, I actively went out of my way between parts to farm up Blaze and Dove specifically because they're part of my endgame team in Super Training to boost Blaze's 2 attack stats and speed, and Dove's special attack stat and physical defense. Now, word of note, I probably should have actually put Blaze entirely into physical attack and speed instead, given what their ultimate evolution ends up being much more specialized in. But it's not that big a deal, as in the case you make a mistake, especially this early on, there's an active bag you can get through Super Training known as a reset bag that just completely resets all progress on that. That roughly took about an hour per Pokemon, kind of tedious, and that's easily the least amount of progress we've made in 4 hours in one of these games to date so far. But Super Training does that for me. I honestly really do like Super Training, but it can be a time sink. With that said, time for our next new Pokemon. This is Seedot. This is what you can encounter over in Omega Ruby on Route 102 rather than Lotad. Pure Grass type, so it's weak to Flying, Poison, Bug, Fire, and Ice. It's got an okay defense stat, and if you fully evolve it, you do get some pretty good overall stats out of it. And it has a really good learn set on top of that, but the subtype it gains along the way to that final evolution gives it so many weaknesses that it kind of immediately disqualifies it in my head from ever being used in a team in any regards outside of maybe a challenge run or if I'm feeling very different. I love the design of the line, just not one I'll actively use too much. It did notably get a new ability for its final evolution in Scarlet and Violet that is really good, but again, just not one I tend to use. Which is kind of funny in retrospect, because I want to say back when I played Ruby decently often, I did try to use one relatively regularly, but because that was still during the period where I only really put effort into my starter, it was probably only its stage 2 evolution by the time of even the 6th gym badge, which, yeah, poor choices at all grounds on that, honestly. I guess getting into that a little bit, Gen 3 with the Fire Red remake is where I started playing Pokemon, but after I picked up Leaf Green as well, just to have both versions, I did eventually find myself picking up, I think, Emerald first out of the original Gen 3. It was either that or Sapphire because I really liked Blue. Ruby I have as well, but I played it definitely the least of the 3. Although, like with other Pokemon games I've played, I only really consistently got maybe 7 gym badges in before just kind of restarting, because I was like, well, I'm stuck because of how I played the games. Alpha Sapphire, on the other hand, I think I picked up Day of. I definitely did for X and Y. I think that was the first time I actively got one of these games, like, day of release. But I digress. Before we head into the next area, though, which is our first real mini-dungeon of sorts, let's take a moment to go talk about the new fairy type that they added in Gen 6, since this is the first time we're tackling Gen 6 on this channel. So to explain the fairy type and why its introduction is major, and honestly in some form was overdue, we first need to talk a bit about the history of balance in Pokemon. We've talked a bit about this so far in the LP. Types on a Pokemon represent them both defensively and the moves they use offensively. Types have a rock, paper, scissors effect against each other, wherein they do half damage to some, but doubled to others. Pokemon using the same move as their type multiplies the damage done as well by an additional 1.5 times. When the original Gen 1 released, there were only these 15 types. On top of that, there were only 5 stats assigned to Pokemon: HP, Attack, Defense, Special, and Speed. When it came to offense in Gen 1, these types used the attack stat for their damage calculation. Meanwhile, these used the special stat for damage calculations. On paper, this sounds fine. In execution, there were all sorts of unfortunate weightings. For one thing, the special stat was weighed against itself for damage calculation, meaning Pokemon with high special stats were also good defenders against those with high special stats. Thus, anything with a low special stat was usually punching out of its weight class. In particular, the very high special stats inherent to psychic types made them absurdly powerful, while other Pokemon with high special stats or other specially minded types got worse deals. If you're used to later games especially, ghost types were in a bad place at this point, as not only did their own moves use the physical stat for damage despite their usually high special stats, psychic types weren't affected by ghost at all in Gen 1. Then there's the issue of dragon types. While there was only one line of them in the game, the type itself was notably hardy, only being weak to ice and itself. However, there were just as many ice types in Gen 1 as there were dragon, and while they were effective for dealing with them, whether or not you had them was a separate issue. So, with those issues in mind, in Gen 2 they changed things up a bit. For one thing, the special stat was split into the current special attack and special defense stats, which, alongside the now super effective nature of Ghost type against Psychic, gave that side of things the rebalancing it needed. Generation 2 also introduced 2 more types, Dark and Steel. While new Pokemon were created to fit those types, some from Generation 1 were also reclassified to have them as a main or subtype. Dark type further helped fight to pin down Psychics, being super effective against them as well as Ghost, while also giving fighting another advantage to work with. Psychic Pokemon were still very good, but these changes went a long way to make them feel more approachable as opponents. But now let's talk about Steel type. It gave Pokemon some extra defenses against Rock and Ice, but while its weakness to fighting gave it and other types their own boost, the only impact this had on the larger balancing issues in Generation 1 was resisting Dragon. While that, alongside the special split, did impact Dragon's power position, they were still hardy. That resistance was limited to the few Steel-type Pokemon present, and since Dragon wasn't weak to Steel, whatever other Pokemon could learn Steel-type moves gained no advantage. And the one new Dragon that was introduced, well, if the stories about Claire's Kingdra in specific are any indication, things could get rough. While Gen 3's introduction of abilities did buff some Pokemon and types here and again, giving them away certain weaknesses or even giving outright second immunities, Dragons also getting abilities means that didn't exactly help shift the balance in any notable way outside of the new Dragons actively having subtypes more often that you could actively take advantage of than the Dragon type. Generation 4 changed balancing again in perhaps the most drastic way thus far. Remember how moves using the physical or special attack stats were tied to its type? Not anymore. That was now determined by the move itself. This was the physical special split. Go check out my Soul Silver LP's first episode for more on that. This did buff and nerf several Pokemon, but at this point the biggest weaknesses Dragons had was the fact that most of their subtypes made them quadruple weak to Ice. Gen 5 had its share of changes, but from memory, not many actively impacted this conversation outside of some Pokemon getting stronger again as they introduced the rare hidden abilities that potentially played into the different strengths of all Pokemon. With that said, once again, because Dragons also usually had really good hidden abilities, it's still an uphill battle. But at this point, the hill's peak is in sight. Generation 6 shattered the dreams of Dragon-type Pokemon. Fairy-type was introduced here, and they largely did the exact same thing they did when Dark and Steel were introduced. Several new Pokemon were created to fit into the type, but also several easy-to-find Pokemon actively had it added to them as a new subtype. Fairy is weak to Poison and Steel, but strong against Dark and Fighting. But most notably, it gave Dragon types their biggest nightmare, a type of Pokemon they couldn't damage at all. Fairy is immune to Dragon-type moves, completely. Fairies do not care. These cute little bugs will murder the medieval fantasy asses. While Dragons are still powerful as they usually have high or even pseudo-legendary tier stat values, Fairy being introduced gave players a much more consistent and interesting way to deal with them that wasn't ultimately either using a Dragon themselves, packing an Ice-type move, or otherwise targeting a subtype. It was a change for the best. With that out of the way, welcome to Petalburg Woods. Like a lot of other Pokemon games that have a forest dungeon pretty early in, expect to find a lot of grass and bug-adjacent type Pokemon here that have potential for early teams, admittedly. There's 2 in specific that I really like to use in some form or manner here and again, and I might even catch one of them while we're here. That said, Hidden Potion right here. Largely, items you can pick up in the field are going to be labeled with Pokeballs you can pick up. But several areas in the game just outright have invisible items you can find. Using a different key item we'll get later on, but I know where a lot of them are, so I pick them up as I go. There's even some I backtrack for when I realize, oh wait, I forgot to go grab those. Whoops. Worth noting, by the way, because of how Hoenn's level design goes, largely there's a lot of ways either around the grass tiles to avoid random encounters or around trainers to begin with. And while I do take those, I usually still go out of my way to battle enemies and everything along the way, if only just to increase my experience yield by endgame. Albeit, again, like I've already mentioned, it's very easy to go overkill on your levels in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire for a couple of split reasons in general. That's a one to be found. Hello, have you seen any Pokemon called Shroomish around here? I really love that Pokemon. I was going to ambush you, but you had to dawdle in Petalburg Woods forever, didn't you? I got sick of waiting, so here I am. You, Devon researcher, hand over those papers. Ah! You're a Pokemon trainer, aren't you? You've got to help me, please. Huh? What do you think you're doing? What, you gonna protect him? No one who crosses Team Aqua gets any mercy, not even a kid. Come on and battle me. In what is off the top of my head, the earliest you get introduced to any rival team in any Pokemon game, time for our first battle against a Team Aqua Grunt. Although over in Omega Ruby and Ruby version, this is a Team Magma Grunt. They both just throw out a level 9 Poochyena, Dark type, so Psychic's not going to be too good about them, but if you have any Fighting type moves at this point, that's a good way to go around it. Mind you, with how early game Pokemon HPs and damage totals work out, it's pretty easy to not have to worry too much about this fight. Heck, technically speaking, with Blaze already being level 13, I'm technically a little bit over-leveled compared to even the GBA version in my memory. Mind I say that I haven't played the original Gen 3 in fewer years than it feels like, because I did do a playthrough of it on stream in like 2022 or so, but that was more future prepping for other things. You're crazy strong! You got some nerve meddling with Team Aqua. Come on and battle me again. I wish I could say that, but I'm out of Pokemon. And, hey, we of Team Aqua are also after something in Rustboro. I'll let you go for today. Bye. Huh, that was awfully close. Thanks to you, he didn't rob me of these important papers. I know, I'll give you this as my thanks. And now we get the experience share. The experience share is a super high-tech device. I had to strain every fiber in my brain and body to develop this device. Turn the switch on, and the battle experience will be shared by all party Pokemon. Please give it a try. And with this, I'll restore your Pokemon's health. It's another technical advantage I'm proud of. The Gen 3 remakes here really like giving you mid-area heal points out of nowhere like this, by the way. Ah! Didn't that Team Aqua Thug say they were after something in Rustboro, too? Uh-oh, it's a crisis. I can't be wasting time. So, the experience share. This is also, I think, the earliest you get it in general in the series, outside of how it gets adapted starting in, I think, Gen 7 or 8. In prior games, this was a held item you can give to someone, and they would earn experience as if they participated in a battle, even if they never did. In Gen 6 beyond, it now applies to all party Pokemon. Participating in battle still gives them more, but any Pokemon you have in the party will earn 50% of any experience earned in battle, alongside any EV values from the Pokemon you defeat along the way. Which means, if you're doing EV training, it can actually be a bit of a hazard. But also it means your Pokemon can get really high leveled very quickly in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire. If there's anything that makes this a much easier game in general than the original Gen 3 outside of the addition of the Fairy type, it's the changes to the experience share. I don't mind it in general. I do think it actively shoots a lot of the game's difficulty curve in the foot, and I think Gen 7 actually makes some steps towards bettering that a lot. But this is how the experience share works moving forward while it's still an item, and starting in Let's Go in Gen 8, it's just a native thing that's in your party to begin with. It's no longer even an item. Moving on, though, we just actively took out our next new Pokemon. That was Nincada, a bug ground type, meaning it's weak to flying, fire, water, and ice, but immune to electric. For a first stage bug type, it has a pretty nuts defense stat, but that's not the reason you use this Pokemon in my eyes. You use it for its evolution that has a really good attack stat and a, frankly, nuts speed stat for an early game Pokemon. On top of that, there's an extra little caveat to its evolution that we'll talk a bit more about later on because it's very unique, but we actively don't encounter it in that regard for probably over 4/5 the LP, effectively. Just know that if you evolve it, make sure you have a spare party slot and Pokeball on hand. And with that, we're already at the end of Petalburg Woods, but I notably didn't encounter the Pokemon I'm also looking for around here, so it's time for me to actively wander around a bit. I believe I actively end up finding it through a hidden Pokemon encounter here, because this thing has, I think, a 5% encounter rate through the grass. This is Slackoth. Slackoth is a pure normal type, meaning it is weak to fighting and immune to ghost. And at first glance, it doesn't seem that special. It's got okay HP attack and defense stats, but anything other than that, like its special stats or speed, aren't much to write home about. On top of that, it's got the ability Truant, which means every other turn, it literally cannot take action at all. And that probably sounds very bad because it is. Truant is a very large drawback, especially for Slackoth. With that said, as you level it up and as it reaches its final evolution, the reason why it has that ability becomes very obvious, because you get one of the strongest physical tanks you can get in the game that also has some decent speed to back it up. Take it from me, if you want a physical attacker that can also take some hits, Slackoth is always worth your consideration, despite how rough Truant seems to be. Slackoth, the Slacker Pokemon. Slackoth's heart beats just once a minute. Whatever happens, it is content to loaf around motionless. It is rare to see this Pokemon in motion. Just like me, for real, for real. Let's name this one after my buddy Boomba, because this one is actively joining our main team. In fact, I believe once I reach the next Pokemon Center, I do go out of the way to EV train it in the Super Training to, I believe, put especially things into its attack and speed stat, just so I could potentially get ahead of its rare speed issue in late game. Plus, since I got that one through a hidden encounter, I actually got Slash on it to start, which is a really decent normal type move that has a high crit hit rate to begin with, so hey, pretty good lead-in to have for that Pokemon. This is the Petalburg Recon team checking in. I'm afraid I have to begin with an apology, Mr. Matt. It's not good news. The mission's a no-go. A little something cropped up and got in the way. Roger that. Got it. Will do. I'll continue investigating that energy we detected. But that kid sure had some promise as a trainer, I'd say. Well, that was new. Welcome to the northern half of Route 104, and the first thing we want to do while we're here is actually talk to this youngster and get our first of a very common item type across the series, our first TM. Notably, in Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, this was Bullet Seed. Here we get Echoed Voice. Echoed Voice is a bit of an interesting, special, normal type move in that it's not very strong to start, but for every turn you use it in a row, it increases by another 40 power to a max of 200, so we can ultimately get very strong. You just need to put the investment of 5 turns in for it, which in a lot of battles will probably get you pretty far, but at the same time, most battles probably aren't going to get to that point to begin with. But as for TMs, this is the first one we found in the game. They are moves that you can use from your bag to teach your Pokemon, assuming they can learn the move at all. But notably, this is the first Pokemon game we're doing an LP of on the channel that's post-Generation 5. And that's important in regards to TMs because in Gens 1 through 4, TMs you found plenty of across the game, but you could only use them once before either you had to buy a new one or go on a very long breeding chain to pass the move on to a new Pokemon if you wanted them to have it. In Gen 5 Beyond, TMs are effectively infinite. You can use them for your bag whenever many times you want, or at least any TM that you could buy and then lose, you could buy infinite of elsewhere depending on the generation. Meaning move tutoring is ultimately a lot easier to do in Gen 5 Beyond, much for the better. With that said, now we got our next new Pokemon. This is Wingull, a water flying type, meaning it is weak to rock and electric, 4 times weak to electric in specific, but immune to ground. It's got some pretty high speed that it does lose when it evolves, but you do get a decently physically tanky special attacker out of it, so it might be worth it. On top of the fact that water is going to be pretty useful against the next boss fight. I might consider catching one of these if you're new to the game and potentially having trouble with the next boss fight, especially in the original generation. Here in Gen 6, not so much because, well, in general, there's so many more extra mechanics or things that you can use in your favor that the series has ultimately gotten easier as it's gone on, but half that is really just as we age and play these games growing up, you just start to understand how to take care of things more easily. If anything, on a first playthrough of a new Pokemon game, the biggest difficulty is either finding a team you like or trying to figure out the typings entirely for the new Pokemon cast. And there's still some I'll mess up here and again. Heck, I won't lie, there's some Pokemon in this generation I still screw up here and again because I just seldom see them. Now, I'm catching this Wingull, but I don't ultimately use it. I'm more just catching it to say, why not? I do end up doing a lot more catching in this LP than I did my prior two Pokemon LPs, more for the fun of it than anything, really. Wingull's data was added to the Pokedex. Get this, Wingull, of all things, is the seagull Pokemon. Shocking, I know. Wingull rides updrafts rising from the sea by extending its long and narrow wings to glide. This Pokemon's long beak is useful for catching prey. So it's a seagull, oh my god. And And this is actually the first one where I don't really give it a nickname because I don't really intend to use it. I just caught it for the sake of it. Yeah, though, Pokemon series difficulty has always been kind of low to begin with. And because that's no wonder around, I want to say Gen 4 is where Nuzlocke first started becoming a thing. There's been people making their own rule sets to make the games harder to begin with for that reason. Albeit, I will say, the series will always have its rare moments of just throwing some real weird stuff at you out of nowhere that really can challenge you. And not for nothing, even though I do think Gen 5 onwards is easier, especially because of some extra things here and again to make either adventuring easier, or leveling easier, or training for competitive easier. They definitely almost all have one battle in each game. It's like, oh, I'm in danger, uh-oh. With that, welcome to the Pretty Petal Flower Shop. You never need to enter here, but I'm doing it just to show it off. Hello, this is the Pretty Petal Flower Shop, spreading flowers throughout the world. Your name is? Kyle. That's a nice name. Kyle, would you like to learn about berries? Sure. Berries grow on trees that thrive only in soft soil. If you take some berries, be sure to plant one in soft soil. A planted berry will soon sprout, grow into a plant, flower beautifully, and then grow berries again. I want to see the whole wide world filled with beautiful flowers. That's my dream. Please help me, Kyle. Plant berries and bring more flowers into the world. This ties more into the berry system we've seen a couple times already with the Aura and P.E.K.K.A, and I think we just got some cherry berries outside. The held items that are consumable, but you can always grow some more. With that said, you can't grow them easily without first coming here and not only talking to her, but talking to this specific girl in here as well to get the Whalemore Pail. This allows you to infinitely water any given berry to help it grow and gain more out of it. They say whenever you grab berries that you should actively plant some, and I basically never do that outside of I think twice throughout the LP. But that's because I get more than enough berries for what I actively need throughout the game to begin with. Worth noting that growing berries, how long it takes a berry fruit to fully flower and all that depends on the berry and which generation you're playing. I think in Gen 3, it was anywhere from a few hours to upwards of a couple of days. I want to say here in Gen 6, and specifically Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, most berries will grow fruit within like a day or so, but it really depends on the one. If you're going for very specific strategies, they can be useful, but I really just don't care to use them. Also, worth noting, Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire has a day-night cycle, and they actively added some extra steps between full day and full night to make it less jarring compared to earlier games. But we just had that jump cut there because, well, worth noting, I'm emulating for this playthrough, and I was realizing earlier on, depending on how I loaded the game up, things can get a little wonky like that. There's not many times that happens moving forward, though, because I change how I load up moving forward. With that said, time for our next new Pokemon. This is a Shroomish. Pure grass type, meaning it is weak to flying, poison, bug, fire, and ice. It's not a lot to write home about as it is right now. It's got some decent defense stats for a first stage Pokemon, but when it evolves, you get a Pokemon that, while it has a lot of weaknesses, it's got the physical attack and speed to potentially back that up. To a point where I could even recommend using it. On top of the fact that Shroomish can learn a lot of status-inflicting moves, that like Spore and all that, you can use this as a very useful Pokemon for actually catching other Pokemon. Worth noting, since its introduction in the original Generation 2, the day-night cycle does more or less depending on the game. Off the top of my head, thinking about it here in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, it impacts... there's certain NPCs that can give you a new berry every day infinitely. And there's certain events that actively are tied to whatever your 3DS's system clock is that we'll see way later in the game. But worth noting, if you actively change your 3DS's system clock, time-based events will not happen again until the next day because the game can detect that you changed it because it's different from what it is on your save file, I believe. In that regard alone, they actively do a little bit more with it here in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire than they did in the original Ruby Sapphire and Emerald, though, in that there's a day-night cycle at all. From memory, while Gen 3 kept track of the day for berries and things like that, it actively was always daytime when you played the game, barring one instance in Emerald or Sapphire. We're twins, so we battle Pokemon together too. Alright, you're gonna battle our Pokemon. Notably, because this is a remake of the original Generation 3 games, notably we also now have double battles. These have been in every Pokemon LP I've done, barring the original Yellow and Crystal LPs from back when, but they were introduced in Gen 3. Effectively, both sides throw out 2 Pokemon at a time, and either Pokemon can target either Pokemon. There are certain Pokemon that are a lot more useful in doubles than they are in singles, both on the competitive and casual side. There's also many moves and abilities that are distinctly tailored around doubles, to the point where doubles is effectively the main format, I believe, of real-life competitive play. With that said, I don't mind them. I think they're alright. I think they can be a little slow, but that is just my personal tastes. There's a lot more of them in some games than others, and you can really feel it. With that said, worth noting, there are some moves that are great in singles that can actually be a little worse in doubles. As while they are very strong, while they might target even both of the opponent's Pokemon, if you're not careful, there's also certain moves that are really good that also target the other Pokemon on your side, so be careful. Immediate cases of this are a notable Water-type move we'll be seeing later on, and Earthquake for the Ground-type moves. With that said, that's where the real strategy of doubles comes in. On top of held items that can be used for that, you might say throw a Pokemon that has that certain Water-type move out with another Pokemon that maybe gets healed if they get hit by a Water-type move. Or you might throw a Pokemon that has Earthquake out with a Flying type so they can avoid the hit, or with an item that allows them to be floating and avoid the Ground-type moves at least once until they get hit anyway. There's a lot of strategy in double battles. With that said, the ones they throw at you in the main campaign are basically never that interesting, honestly. Welcome to Rustboro City, but we're not going to quite enter the town normally yet because I want to come around here and grab an X defense. X items are effectively a stat boost you can use in battle that fades either when the Pokemon is swapped out or when the battle ends. For speed runs or challenge runs, these can be lifesavers, especially if you don't already have moves that can increase a Pokemon stat in your movesets, which I personally don't like to unless they're a side effect from a move that does damage anyway. I'm very aggro in these games. But for me, myself, and plenty of others, the X items kind of just take up space in their inventory. And in the games where you have limited inventory, in my eyes, you might as well sell them due to that. But thankfully, here in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, your inventory is effectively unlimited. You'll basically never run out of inventory. Just grab anything you can. Become a hoarder. Why not? What could go possibly wrong? One more thing to do before we move on to Rustboro City is that there's one more Pokemon trainer we can battle here, and they also have a new Pokemon for us. Albeit I say new. It's one of the oldest Pokemon in the series because it's been around since Gen 1. This Fisherman is the first instance in this LP of Magikarps. Pure water type, so they're weak to grass and electric. Magikarp is kind of a joke for a reason. Pitifully low HP attack and special stats, okay defense, and some decent speed. But Magikarp can only learn 3 moves. Tackle at level 15, Flail around level 30, and it starts with Splash. Splash does nothing. Except in Gen 7, where you can pair it in a specific way to actually get something kind of funny out of it. Magikarp is effectively a joke, but it's a joke that hides some real potential, as if you actively level it up only a couple levels from when you can first really catch one, you get an excellent physical attacker with some good stats outside of that to really help it as well. You get really rewarded for your efforts if you actively decide to raise one. I don't in this LP. In fact, I don't think I'm ever probably going to use one in the LPs as I go through them. But I won't lie, I've been tempted. It largely comes down to I already have a better plan for a water type. Just don't be like James in the older era of the anime and kick one into the water. It usually might go badly for you. Actually, in that regard, it's kind of weird. This is the first Pokemon game I've done since Ash kind of retired, huh? Weird. So you made it here to Rustboro too, Kyle. It's really big here, isn't it? Little Root can't even compare. Oh, and Kyle, have you heard? There's a Pokemon gym here, too. Once I catch a couple more Pokemon, I'll be sure to take it on with my team. See you later. Now, for story, the next thing you actually want to do here in Rustboro is go to that gym and tackle it. And if you've gotten everything we have, or you have especially Mudkip as your starter, you're not going to have much of an issue there. But I'm going out of my way to talk to everyone in town because there's a lot of items we can get into larger towns like this, especially. For instance, here we get False Swipe. False Swipe's an interesting move. It's not powerful, but that's because it's not really meant to be. The entire thing with it is, if it would otherwise kill an opponent, it'll leave them at 1 HP. And that includes if the opponent's already at 1 HP. False Swipe is largely to help you catch Pokemon. especially if you're, say, in a much later game area or you're in an earlier game area with end game level Pokemon. Using that will prevent you from one-shotting anything. And if you're trying to complete your Pokedex, that can go a really long way, honestly. With that said, I'm not really someone who likes to update the moveset of my Pokemon in late game that often. So moves like this kind of fall by the wayside pretty quickly for me, even if I wanted to use them. So it's not something you'll really see me use in the LP, although even looking far ahead in the footage, there are a couple of times that would have made things a little bit easier, but only by a little, because it would have just meant my catch rates would have been higher or things like that. At the end of the day, when you're dealing with Pokemon low level or high level, if they run out of moves to use, or if they have moves that deal recoil damage to themselves, where they do damage to themselves because of the strength of the move, things like False Swipe can fall out of use very quickly, so you kind of need to watch out and use it on a case-by-case basis. Now, something I'm not sure if I've actually talked about in my other Pokemon LPs is that for some reason, I've always been really attached to the larger cities in the game, and that might be because I just generally prefer being in larger cities or mid-sized cities in my life to begin with. But something about the diorama-like nature of these cities being so much larger than your average RPG town, I've always just found it weirdly cute, I guess. Like, my favorite city in almost every game is either, like, the third largest city or the absolute largest. Like, I love Celadon and Saffron. I love Hearthome City. I love Goldenrod. Although what's kind of interesting, usually my favorite city in a game doesn't change for its remake. Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire actually updates one specific town so drastically that it actually becomes my favorite. Compared to what my favorite was in the original Generation 3, but we'll talk about that in the decently near future, I suppose. This is the Pokemon Trainer School. This is effectively a secondary tutorial area that gets a little bit more into the ins and outs about things like what the badges do in every single gym in Hoenn. Like, for instance, the Stone Badge, Pokemon up to level 20 will obey you without issue, which is a issue that you'll seldom run into in the games, in my experience, because it's there to effectively be an anti-cheesing measure. If you train over a Pokemon that's higher level than your level limit through badges, it'll just effectively disobey you, and depending on the generation, either use a different move, not attack at all, put itself to sleep, do damage from the confusion status ailment to itself, or do all that while also sleeping. The only game where that's not exactly the case is Gen 9 / Scarlet and Violet, where depending on the level you catch a Pokemon at, that can also happen, but again, relatively rare, but it's a little easier to do there given how that game's set up. So the teacher in that school actively gave us an item, the Quick Claw. That's one of my favorite held items in the game to give to slower Pokemon like Slackoth. What that does is that it gives the Pokemon that's holding it roughly, I think it's like a 20% chance of moving first despite their lower speed stat, as long as the opponent isn't using a move that has like a priority 1 or 2 attack, which actively goes first no matter what the speed is going on there. That determined expression, that limber way you move, and your well-trained Pokemon, you're obviously a skilled trainer. No, wait, don't say a word, I can tell just by looking at you. I'm sure you'll be capable of putting this HM to good use. No need to be monster shy, go on, take it. Here we get HM01 Cut. Post Gen 5, HMs are effectively just specialized TMs, but prior to Gen 5, these were a lot more important. HMs are effectively moves that you can also use in the field to do various effects depending on what the HM in question is. For instance, you may have noticed these thinner, kind of prickly looking trees we've seen a couple times up to now. Cut allows a Pokemon that can learn that move to cut those down. However, HMs can only be used after you gain their matching gym badge, so we actually can't use Cut in the field until after we beat the gym leader here in Rustboro. Some HMs are always useful, some are more useful in some games than others. It's why some games actually reclassify certain HM moves into just TM moves and vice versa, as it really just depends on the game. This Ace Trainer gives us a bit of an interesting item for early game. They give us a Float Stone. This is a held item that actively halves the weight of the Pokemon you give it to, and that might sound kind of weirdly useless, but there are uses for it. For one thing, there are ways you can actually transfer items from the Pokemon that you're using to the Pokemon that you're battling. And on top of that, there are some moves that either deal more damage the higher weight your Pokemon is, or that deal more damage to your Pokemon the heavier they are. So that's actively useful to avoid or use in either of those instances if you want to trade items around or things like that. With that said, that's definitely a little more technical play, and I'd say even compared to competitive, That's more useful in player versus player battles than it is any kind of PvE type stuff. So at this point, we're kind of running out of things to do here in Rustboro itself, but before we actually end off, I'm going to head back to Petalburg Woods really quick. Why? It's because of the Cut HM. While some HMs are very good combat moves, others like Cut really aren't. And the thing is, you can't delete HM moves from a Pokemon's Learn set until far later in the campaign, and I don't want to eat up one of any of my main team members' 4 move slots for a move that's really not that good. Thus, I'm back in Petalburg Woods to catch a Zigzagoon, as they can learn a lot of HM moves. Most games you don't necessarily need a dedicated HM user like a Zigzagoon for something like Cut, but it's nice to have around in the case of Hoenn and especially in Sinnoh, for reasons we'll see when I reach that LP. Zigzagoon, the tiny raccoon Pokemon. The hair on Zigzagoon's back is bristly and rubs the hard back hair against trees to leave its territorial markings. This Pokemon may play dead to full foes into battle. And, why not? Let's name this one after my coworker Jimmy. But with that, I'm gonna need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 4, we're gonna head after Rustboro Gym and see what we can do in Rustboro City after that. See you guys then.